Welcome to section 2.4. In this section, we'll add on to our truth tables by looking at the conditional and biconditional truth tables. These will help us ultimately evaluate arguments as we put those together in later sections of this chapter. And so let's worry about the conditional statement first. And so as we do so, I want you to think about an if-then statement, one that I want to resonate with you. So let's suppose I made this statement. If you pay me $100, then I will give you an A in the class. Okay. And so let's think about that. So what this is this is a P implies Q, where P is paying me $100 and Q is a grade of A. I'll put assigned. Okay. So obviously this is fake, right? But I think it will help us to understand. So when we create a truth table, it's the same as it's always been. We need to exhaust all the ways P and Q could be true and false and interact with one another. So it's always true, true, false, false, true, false, true, false to start out with. And then we want, in this case, the symbols is P arrow Q, right? This is the conditional. And so what do we have? So let's look at the first one. So I'll put number 1 here. If we're in row number 1, it's saying you paid me $100 and I assigned you the grade of A. That's exactly what you expected. So the true thing happened. The only time you're going to be upset is if you pay me $100 and then you check e-services after the class ends and I have not given you an A. That's the only time I failed you in my promise. So the first one is you paid me $100 and you got the grade. That's exactly what you expected. My promise I made is true. 2 is that you paid me the $100, but I didn't assign you the grade of A. I walked away with your $100 and didn't do it and denied everything. There you're mad, okay, because I failed in my promise to you. Now, what about number 3? 3 is you didn't even give me $100 at all, right? That's most of the people in the classroom. Didn't give me $100 and you got a grade of A. There's been nothing that's been violated because you didn't give me the $100. You could get a grade of A or you could get a grade that's not an A and my promise would be true. So in 3 and 4, we could have somebody that's doing well in the class and be like, I don't need to pay $100. I've gotten all A's on my exam so far. I'm not paying $100 and they still get their A. That's great. They didn't participate in the process, so there was no promise. Same with number 4. Somebody could be, that's unethical, Jensen. There's no way I'm giving you $100. And then they get a grade of B or C. They didn't get assigned a grade of A, but they didn't expect it either. There's no expectation for 3 and 4. And so the only way an if-then statement is false is if I fail in what I promised you. If the if part is true, but the then part doesn't happen. That's the only time. So I would tell myself about this truth table, it's almost always true. The only time it's not true is if a true is heading to a false. And the order that the arrow goes in is very, very important. So there it is for the conditional. So hopefully that made sense. But even if it doesn't, this is your guide in all of this. This is the conditional, the if-then. The biconditional, this is built off of the conditional. Again, when we establish the biconditional, it is going to be off of a regular truth table that's true, true, false, false, true, false, true, false. And so the way we do this one is we look at the arrows going both ways, because if and only if has to be working both ways. So a good example of an if and only if is you'll get an A in the class if and only if your percentage is 90 or above 89%. And so if you saw that you're above 89%, then you'll get an A. If you look in e-services and you got an A, then when you look in Canvas, you'll see that your overall percentage is above 89. And so that's a good example of an if and only if. So just remember the arrow goes both ways. So true implies true, true implies true, that whole thing is true. True implies false is false, so this whole thing is false. False implies true is true, but going backwards, going this way would be false. And false implies false is true. False implies false is true. So the only way a biconditional is true is if both of the items have the exact same truth value. If they're different truth values, it will not be true from a biconditional point of view. I don't see a lot of biconditional work being used, but they do bring it up in our book, so we will. And so we want to make sure that you remember your ands and your ors. So P, Q, P, let's do or first. Or Q. So that's true, true, false, false, true, false, true, false. And the or, remember the or just needs somebody to be true. Okay, and so that's true, 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 false. And then P and Q. That's true, true, false, false, true, false, true, false. And then and needs both of them to be true. If any one of them is false, the whole thing is false. And we're using these as a guide every time. I'm not going to write the negation because I think you know that for sure. But you're going to be anchored in these guys right here. Basically, this is all the notes that you need. I would highly suggest you not write out problems. I think it's actually been hurtful to individuals that are trying to match problems from their notes to the exam. I think we saw that on the last exam, so be careful. So what's going to happen is the same thing that happened in the previous section. You're going to be given something like number 3. Oh, actually, let's do number 4. Apologize. Number 4. Number 4 says P, Q, negation of Q, P, if and only if, negation of Q. And they tell you P is false and Q is true. So this is how they start you out, and they'd like you to finish it. All right. Well, if Q is true, then the negation of Q is false. And then you have your double arrows between these guys. So we have a false double arrow negation of Q. So I got a false going back and forth to a false. That's this last column right here. So let me go up and make sure we're tracking the same way. I'm in this last column. So, oh, apologize. I am not in that last column. Because this is a double arrow, so that's right up here. I'm this guy. Get in here. I'm this guy right here. Right? Actually, let me do better than that. I'm this guy right here. False double arrow false. And we know the result of that is true, right? Because of that last statement there. So there's no promises made either way, so there's no violation that can happen. And you're done. You filled out the thing. That's what 4 is going to feel like and beyond. How bad does it get? Not bad. Let's take a look at something like let's go double. Let's go to number 8. Number 8 has P, Q, R. It also has the negation of P, the negation of R, the negation of P and Q, the negation of P and Q, biconditional with the negation of R. So take a look at that very last one that I wrote, that last column header. That is why we have all these subsequent ones. because we need to know what the negation of P and the negation of R are. We need to figure out the negation of P and Q independent in the biconditional, and so we just build ourselves up. It also tells us that P is false, Q is false, and R is false. The rest is up to us. So the negation of P, we absolutely know is true. The negation of R is true. The negation of P and Q, now remember with the and, as long as one of them is false, the whole thing is false. You can also come back right up to your and, right? So we're looking at that upside down V, that's this guy right here. And what do we have? We have a false and a true. That's this column right here. And so that is why the overall result is false, right? Overall result is false. And that's why we're writing a false there. Great. So we did what we could do there. And so now what do we have? We have the negation of P and Q, but we have that truth value. It's right there. We have the negation of R. We have that truth value. It's right there. And we got it going biconditionally. So if I go look at the biconditional with a true and a false, okay, well, let's look at the biconditional. Every time it wasn't the exact same truth value on either ends, it was false. So we're right in these mixtures right here. So the overall result is false. And we're finished, right? They just want us to evaluate that. And that's all that happens in this section, is we have these truth values involved. Then they do the same thing that we did in the last one, and that is they give us a statement like number 16. So here's what number 16 says. 16 says, if Giacomo works with Fahim and Anne is a project manager, then the software application will be was completed on time. Sorry, it's past tense. You're like, what in the world? That's what it looks like when I looked at 16. So then we go up above 16. And it says, assume these statements are true. Okay. And I'm going to go look for the ones. Anne is a project manager. So Q is Anne is a project manager. And they're telling us that that's true. How do we know? Because they tell us. They tell us that R is Giacomo works with Fahim. They're telling us that's true. They're telling us that Anne's a project manager, Giacomo works with... and they're telling us that the software application being completed on time, I'll just put completed on time, is also true. So the way I'm reading it, and I'll read it out loud here. For the following exercise, assume that these statements are true. Fahim is a software engineer. Anne is a project manager. Giacomo works with Fahim, and the software application was completed on time. So everything's true. So let's look what we have. Let's put it out in symbols. Giacomo works with Fahim. That's R. And, I know the symbol for and, it's that guy right there. Anne is a project manager. Okay, that's Q. If both of those things, then the software application was completed on time. So what do we have? I don't think we have to do a big old truth table. We could just put in the truth values because it's just a simple statement. True and true implies true. Let's work here. True and true. Okay, it's an and statement. If they're both true, the whole thing's true. And then an if-then statement, the if part is true, the then part is true, so the whole thing is true, right? We're just going and looking at all of these truth values here, right? So two ands being true right here, that's why we wrote the whole thing is true. If and only if, I'm sorry, not if and only, but if then, true implies true, the whole thing is true. So that's why we have that last true in there. And we just get familiar with all of those different items. And that takes us through 20. And then it finishes out by asking us to look at some conditionals and biconditionals. I want to focus on something like 22. But they're asking us to do full truth tables at the end. So 22 says the negation of Q implies P or the negation of Q. Now notice there's no parentheses. So we will have to know the order of operations. So that was back in 2.2. I would highly recommend writing that dominance table down. And what it says is that we do the ands and ors before the implies. Okay, so we do parentheses, negations, disjunctions, conditional, and then biconditional. Okay. And so let's take a look at what we would do here. So we need to establish the truth table for this statement. So we always start in the same way, P and Q, true, true, false, false, true, false, true, false. And then we say, well, do we have any negations? Yeah, we have a negation of Q. It's happening twice, but we're going to establish this, false, true, false, true. Then what would be the next thing to happen? The next thing to happen is you would do your ands and ors before you do the implies. So the next thing to happen is P and the negation of Q. And then the last thing to happen would be the negation of Q heading to, and you should put in parentheses so that you realize you already have that full truth value that it's going to. And this is one of the last problems that are in there. And so maybe I should do something to highlight a fact. We are coming up with everything in blue. Everything in blue, everything in black, actually all of this stuff over here too, right, we came up with. But everything that's in the PQ, that's our standard, and then we look to what we're being asked to know how we're going to do the columns. So P and negation of Q. Remember, and needs them both to be true. If any one of them's false, the whole thing's false. So this is false, right, because we're doing these outside ones. This is true, then we have false and false. So it looks just like that. And then we come in here, we get rid of this line, and now we're going, and it really makes a difference the order of the arrow. So now we're going to negation of Q, whoops. We're doing, and let me put it in red, we're going from here to here. This is the way my arrows are going. So false implies false is true. Right? If you've made no promise, right? If you didn't meet the first condition, then there is no promise. If you didn't give me $100, it doesn't matter what your grade is. But if you gave me the $100, you should expect a grade of A, and you got it. You didn't give me $100, so there is no promise. You did give me $100, and I didn't give you an A. That's false, right? The only time a conditional is false, let's go look at it. The only time a conditional is false is if you have true heading to false. And that's what we had for this last one, is a true heading to a false. This is the result of the answer. So this is not a valid statement because not all of them were true. Okay. And so the back of the book may put out the table. Sometimes they just put the end, which is, and they'll put it in order from top to bottom. So they may list out the answer as true TTTF. That would be you getting the correct answer. If you saw TFTT, do not tell yourself, well, I got one F and so we're good. This is very specific. It's in the order of what's here from the top column. The only one that matches is this guy right here. So as you check your answers in the Student Solutions Guide, just make sure that you are tracking it okay, that you really do have the right answer. So that's all that's happening in this section. It's very much an extension. Doing this another time will help you to just solidify your knowledge of truth tables. This is a very high performing exam because once you have the idea of truth tables and you can just motivate and work within that system, it tends to be very, very straightforward for individuals. So have fun with it. Reach out with questions as you have them. There's great examples in the book as well that walk through it. But everything is just about building the right framework and then doing one decision at a time. Always anchoring yourself in these truth tables, right? Make sure you have those written down and then just refer to them. What you'll find as you move forward is that you'll refer to them less and less. You'll be able to say, oh, it's an or statement. So as long as one of them is true, the whole thing's true. Oh, it's an and statement. So if any one of them is false, the whole thing is false. Oh, it's a conditional statement. The only time that's false is if you have a true going to a false, right? Those are the types of languages you'll eventually have, and you'll find that you're very